Okay, thank you. I'm going to speak a little bit about Istanbul and Turkey today, and I'm going to break down the recent history of Turkey over the last 15 years. And it all started with 2004 when the current president, then he was the prime minister, Erdogan, inaugurated Istanbul Modern Museum. Never mind the fact that he had closed down one in 1994 as Istanbul's mayor, the first contemporary art museum, only a decade ago. Now, 2004 felt like spring had arrived after years of war in the east, or bombs exploding in Istanbul, vast leeway given to security forces and the deep state. Many other institutions began to operate that year. EU accession talks opened, laws and regulations were adopted to EU standards. Erasmus students began to change the fabric of neighborhoods. Turkey was a favorite country for European funds that began to trickle and flow into the cultural institutions. Tourism picked up. By tourism, I don't mean just tourism, but just we saw different faces in the streets. And the great catastrophe of 1915 seemed to be on a path to acceptance. The Kurdish question saw massive steps towards a resolution. LGBTI communities were more safe. Police became more liable for their actions, and we began to discuss the pros and cons of what was at that time called normalization. The government itself did not care so much for this new institutional cultural sphere, but rode the wave of tourism and leveraged, for example, institutions like Istanbul Foundation for Culture and Arts, which is the institution that does the Istanbul Biennial, for the city's promotion and festivals abroad. And until the end of 2011, for the government, the idea was to support two different kinds of cultural fields. These were two distinct fields. One was secular, the other one would be conservative, one cosmopolitan, the other one provincial. One is artistic, the other one is crafty, one is more touristic, and the other one is more endemic. Just kind of very strange register. And there were to be no crossovers between them. And Erdogan was a master in navigating this strategy of living together without interference. This is a kind of an Ottoman style of coexistence whereby different societies live under one protection without mixing with each other, as long as you know who sets the rules. Erdogan swept the elections at the end of 2011 and dropped the liberal support that paved the path to normalization. The first salvo came in 2012 with the introduction of the idea of conservative art by the General Secretary of the President. The Secretary declared that the cultural sector in Turkey has been monopolized by the leftovers of the 60s and 70s style leftists. However, there has never been such a monopoly because they were never supported, neither financially nor by the state. They were legally harassed, fired from their jobs, discredited, hunted, prisoned, killed, and even burnt in 1991, alive throughout and there's too many incidents around the history of the Republic. The Minister of Culture, a former social democrat and a deal breaker between the intelligentsia and Erdogan, resigned in 2013, sealing this period for good. At the same time, a fundamental shift in foreign policy took place, especially regarding the Middle East. Neo-Ottomanism came back, the empire reflex, and it began to be spelled out in caps. Now, urban transformation had been taken over by a massive state construction company, almost about 55% of all construction in the country. This meant the militarized urban transformation, destruction of the environment, and turbo-capitalism. This all led to the Gezi resistance in the summer of 2013. And artists were there en masse, culture producers were there, and these new alliances, friendships, communities, and a new language emerged that bonded, and it stayed strong despite everything up until now. Artists did not produce a pornography of images from Gezi, they were only transformed by it. The window of Gezi and politics of hope led to HDP, once a Kurdish party limited to a regional base, or regional support base, to win 13% of the vote in June 2015. Erdogan would not have it. He stopped the peace process and called for early elections, and a full-scale war conditions resumed in the east. And after all of this, Erdogan's party claimed the majority again in November of 2015. The rest is the story you know from the papers. And in the last 2 years, at least half of Turkey's cultural community and literary community and academics left the country. I mean, this is the biggest brain drain or culture drain we've ever had in the history of 20th and 20th, well, I mean, from 1915 onwards, at least. Now, the key here is to understand the profound transformation of the urban fabric. 20th century modern urban fabric is now being serially destroyed and replaced by a new state architecture. And this architecture is a kind of Ottoman melange in taste and contemporary in materials. 20th century is being programmatically erased. That makes the witnesses to times lived lose all details about their lives lived there. All of your anchors to the city are erased. We come to deal with what Bourdieu used to call the representations of the new represented society. Well, spatial alienation is one thing. The second is to be castigated as being inauthentic, Western, or not belonging to the national body. It makes you feel like an alien, a virus, or an outsider just looking in. This is supported by further defamations, such as being framed as agents of open society, Soros foundations, or other foundations, the tools of the West, and in general, foreign agents. And I will quote the Turkish-British Council, I mean, the Turkish style of British Council's board member said exactly in 2013, if you're a Jew, a Greek, or an Armenian, I understand your participation in Gezi. Never before exercised archaic regulations are now exercised to provoke new crises. Not-for-profits, particularly foundations, are subjected to partisan audits. Undercover officers harass programmers, and the pro-government press and columnists target venerable institutions. There's a huge scale discreditation. And through this process, I've been recently interviewing, just to put a record of time, many writers and cultural producers who left the country, and I will quote a few things from them. I am no longer interested in the concept of a homeland. I find it fanatical. Nationalism is something I abhor in every form. My life was not in direct danger in Turkey. What we were encountering was a psychological erosion. My situation about not having a homeland is as someone who does not need a homeland. I feel more at home in Berlin than in Istanbul, but Berlin too is not something I will say I will never give up. I miss the place that I come from, knowing that place does not exist anymore. So I sometimes suffer from a set of emotion states, varying from melancholia to euphoria, simply because I'm a firm believer that any intersubjectivity, psychoanalytically speaking, is almost impossible. But I feel sympathetic relating to the term heimat loss, since any heimat is viciously poisonous for the human soul, hindering it from the thriving in its best sense. And this is the last one was very dramatic for me. It says, I don't have anyone to hold, embrace, and cry together when I hear the news from Turkey. So Erdogan's holy grail is to create a smooth and harmonious space with a singular aim. It's a society of bliss under an autocratic management. Of course, the hiccups of this throwback engineering that refers to the 1930s than to current times are, however, too loud to ignore, as the defamatory tactics and ruthless othering turned him into an allergen for actually almost half of Turkey. Now, what is to be done? Maybe three main things. One is refuging, not refuge, but refuging into a community of colleagues, locally and internationally, a place where power relations don't exist or are not reproduced between a beneficiary and a good host. Second is learning from each other and instituting new forms of solidarity, conviviality, and community. And the third one is to build the new within the old. A very nice colleague, Kaylin Wilson-Goody, wrote something, a year-end report in Freeze magazine in 2015, and before I step out, I'm going to read this to you because I think it was quite brilliant. Europe has been systematically destroyed, bit by bit and piece by piece, in some of the most awful acts of spectacular violence seen anywhere in this century. The artists, dissidents, activists, and intellectuals of Baghdad, Damascus, Aleppo who, unlike their counterparts from Beirut, Casablanca, Algiers, Tunis, Cairo, Alexandria, or Istanbul, have never been so widely cast into exile before. The dictatorships of Iraq and Syria tended to imprison or kill their opposition figures, rather than allowing them to escape or flee. They are now so scattered and traumatized that it seems unlikely they will ever regroup and retell the stories of what they've done and seen, or reflect on the ideas, debates, works, and arguments they've given to the world. Paris, for this generation, isn't, sadly can't be, tragically won't be what it was for generations of erudite Arab exiles in the past. Thank you.